I had been watching in CBS while I was rehearsing my show. I had been watching the monitor out of the corner of my eye, peripherally, and I saw this skinny guy bouncing around, making a lot of animated movements, and I was rehearsing my show that was going to go on that night at 11:25. So he had a variety show, I think every Wednesday night on CBS. So every Wednesday night I saw this guy. So finally one night I said to the director, I said, Bill, I said, turn this guy up. Who is this guy? So that was my first knowledge of a guy named Johnny Carson. So they turned up the volume and I watched him do a skit. And the skit was a great, great skit that he and I loved, but the audience didn't quite go for the skit. They didn't quite get it, but he and I loved it. And then I heard him say, my name is Johnny Carson. Now, a year later, Edward R. Murrow, one of the great names in our broadcasting business, had a show similar to what like a Barbara Walters does now, interviewing big people in the news. And what would happen was Edward R. Murrow wouldn't go to someone's home. They wouldn't go and interview them like Barbara Walters does. Edward R. Murrow would stay in the studio and the cameras would go to someone's home. You go see Jimmy Stewart and Edward R. Murrow say, is that the fireplace you mentioned earlier? The one you got in France? And then Jimmy Stewart say, that's it, Ed, this is it. This is the one, I found it. And then that was the end. That was the way they would do it. When I got back from the Korean War, I had asked the owner of the apartment complex where I lived to save an apartment for me. I would be back soon. I said, I don't know when, but I'm going to call you, but please have an apartment. He and I were great buddies. Turns out that he did have an apartment for me. You know, he had 1,200 apartments. They were changing all the time. So I called him when I got back in the country from Treasure Island. He was my second call. I called my wife, told her I was in the country, I was alive, I'd see her soon. But my next call was to a guy named Dan Kelly, one of my buddies and pals. And I called Dan. I said, yeah, I got a great apartment for you. It's a bigger apartment, 3 bedrooms. You're going to love it. I move into my big apartment. I get my family together. I had 2 children at this time. I bring them up, 3 children as a matter of, no, 2 children. And I bring them up, and I've got a 3-bedroom apartment. I'm king of the hill. Who is my next door neighbor? I want to go say hello. It's like a duplex. So I walked next door, knocked on the door, Dick Clark. Now, Dick Clark had gotten bandstand while I was gone. I knew him. He was a disc jockey. And he had gotten, and so I knew him, you know, being in the business. He had gotten bandstand while I was gone. Now he was getting hot. Then he had American Bandstand, cover of Time magazine, really hot. Edward R. Murrow is going to do him. So all the CBS guys are there. Edward R. Murrow's in New York, and they're doing Dick Clark. My kids are all excited. I'm excited, so forth. And Dan Kelly throws a party for the crew from New York, invites me to the party. At the party, he said, Ed, get up and entertain these people. I said, what? He said, entertain these people from New York. Get up and do a show. So he owned the building, he owned the club, he owned everything. So I got up on the mic and, you know, made it up as I went along, ad-libbed it. And Dick Clark's producer, Chuck Reeves, was in the group. And he walked up to me afterwards and he said, you are really good. He said, you ever think about going to New York? I said, only every second of every minute of every hour of every day. He said, good, I'm going to remember that. Well, you hear that a lot, but it doesn't happen. Oddly enough, Chuck Reeves' office was right next to Dick Stark's office in the Little Theater. Dick Stark was the producer of Who Do You Trust, starring Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson's announcer, Bill Nimmo, had to leave. He got his own show, and they wouldn't let him do 2 shows. They wouldn't let him host a show and be the announcer on the Carson show. They got to get a new announcer. They're talking outside of Chuck Reeves' office about this one day, Johnny and Art Stark. And Chuck says, I got the guy for you. I'll have him up here tomorrow morning. Called Dick Clark, said, get your neighbor's rear end up here. I got a great job for him. I came up to New York, met Johnny Carson, and as they say, the rest is history. And we had a very no value meeting, but that's the way Johnny is. I learned much, much later. Johnny made up his mind as soon as I walked in, and he asked me a question or something. The way I responded, he made up his mind. So the rest of the time we spent looking out the window at the Schubert Theater across the street. They were changing the marquee. They were bringing in those new marquees with the opaque glass. taking down the old Tivoli light kind of marquee. And he and I were watching that out of two different windows in his office. Two cranes were lifting this thing up, and it was quite a, an endeavor. And that's what the interview was. Us looking out the window. That's just about two questions. Where'd you go to school? What are you doing now? That was the interview. And I got back on the train, went back to Philadelphia. I said, well, I blew that job. And then on a Friday, the phone rings. It's Art Stark. He said, we'd like you to wear suits. I said, what? He said, Johnny likes to wear sport coats. We want you to wear suits, so we'll emphasize your size next to John. I said, what are you talking about? He said, oh, didn't they tell you? You got the job. That's how I found out.